Nobody at the dinner table noticed the old watch on Walter Greene's wrist. Not really. To them, it was just another piece of junk the old man refused to throw away. Scratched silver, cracked leather strap, a face so faded you could barely read the numbers anymore. His grandson once called it the saddest watch in America. Everyone laughed when he said it. Walter laughed too, but only because it was easier than explaining why he still wore it every single day. Outside, cold November rain tapped softly against the windows of the suburban Ohio home his son had bought 12 years earlier. The house was beautiful in the way modern homes often were. Large kitchen, polished hardwood floors, oversized television glowing quietly in the background. Warm, comfortable, full of people, and somehow still the loneliest place Walter had ever lived. At 78 years old, Walter had gotten used to becoming invisible. It happened slowly. First, people asked fewer questions. Then they stopped waiting for his answers. Eventually, they stopped noticing him altogether. "Grandpa, you already told that story," his granddaughter Sophie said as she scrolled through her phone. Walter paused halfway through his sentence. "Oh," he said softly. "Did I? You tell it every Thanksgiving," his grandson Tyler added without looking up from his plate. Linda, Walter's daughter-in-law, sighed as she carried another dish to the table. "Well, maybe this year we can get through dinner without hearing about gas prices in 1962. A few people chuckled. Walter smiled politely and lowered his eyes to his plate. Same routine, different holiday. His son, Richard, noticed the awkwardness and tried to help. "Dad was just talking," he muttered. Linda shrugged. "I know. I'm kidding." But she wasn't. Not really. Walter had learned the difference years ago. He quietly cut another piece of turkey while conversation moved around him like traffic flowing past a broken-down car. Nobody asked how his doctor appointment went that morning. Nobody asked why his hands had been shaking more lately. Nobody asked much of anything anymore. And honestly, Walter didn't blame them entirely. People liked usefulness. And old age had a way of making a man feel less useful every year. 3 years earlier, after his wife Margaret died from cancer, Richard insisted Walter move into the small garage apartment behind the family home. At the time, it sounded temporary. A few months maybe, just until Walter got back on his feet. But grief didn't work that way. Neither did aging. Now the garage apartment had quietly become his whole world. One small bedroom, one recliner, one coffee maker older than his grandchildren. And silence. Lots of silence. Tyler got accepted into Northeastern. Linda suddenly announced proudly at the dinner table. That got everyone's attention immediately. Walter looked up with genuine excitement. "Northeastern University?" he asked. "That's wonderful." Tyler nodded casually, trying to act less excited than he really was. "Business program." Walter smiled warmly. "That's a great school." "It's also insanely expensive," Linda added quickly. The atmosphere shifted almost instantly. Richard rubbed the back of his neck. "We're figuring it out. We'll need loans," Linda said. "And probably a second mortgage." Tyler stared down at his plate uncomfortably. Walter's smile faded slightly. He knew that look on Richard's face. Stress. The same look Walter himself carried for years while raising a family on factory wages. For a moment, guilt crept into his chest. Not because he'd done something wrong, but because old men living in garage apartments tended to feel guilty for existing. Linda reached for her wine glass. "You know what's frustrating?" she said. "We spend so much money taking care of everybody else that we can't even help our own son the way we want." Richard glanced at her carefully. "Linda, no, I'm serious." Her eyes shifted briefly toward Walter. Subtle, but not subtle enough. Walter felt it immediately, that familiar tightening in his chest. The feeling of being discussed instead of spoken to. "We pay for medications, utilities, groceries," Linda continued. "Everything adds up." Silence settled around the table. Tyler cleared his throat awkwardly. Sophie suddenly became very interested in her phone again. Richard looked exhausted. Walter stared quietly at his mashed potatoes. He had heard this conversation before, just never this openly. Finally, Walter spoke. "I can contribute more." Richard looked up immediately. "Dad, you don't have to." "I want to." Linda folded her arms. "With what exactly?" The question landed harder than she probably intended. Or maybe exactly as hard as she intended. Walter hesitated. Not because he was ashamed. Because he knew the truth sounded pathetic. His savings were almost gone. Cancer treatments had taken most of what he and Margaret spent 40 years building. The rest disappeared after inflation, prescriptions, and basic living expenses slowly ate through what remained. Walter owned very little now. A few clothes, some old photographs, Margaret's wedding ring in a dresser drawer, and the watch. Always the watch. Tyler tried to lighten the mood. Well, he joked, pointing toward Walter's wrist. Maybe Grandpa's antique watch collection is secretly worth millions. Sophie laughed immediately. Oh my God, imagine. Linda smirked into her wine glass. Walter looked down at the watch quietly. His thumb brushed across the cracked leather strap. For just a second, his expression changed. Not anger, not embarrassment. Something deeper, something almost painful. Then he smiled again. Small, tired, polite. Some things are worth more than people think, he said softly. Nobody responded, because nobody understood what he meant. Dinner continued, but Walter barely spoke after that. He listened while Tyler talked about dorms and business classes. Listened while Linda worried about tuition payments. Listened while Richard promised everything would somehow work out. And the entire time, Walter kept thinking the same thing. I should help them. Not because they treated him well. Not because they appreciated him. Because that was what fathers did. Even old ones. Especially old ones. Later that night, Walter sat alone in the garage apartment while rain rattled softly against the roof. A small lamp beside his recliner cast warm yellow light across the room. Margaret's photograph sat on the shelf nearby. Walter looked at it for a long time. You always said family mattered most, he whispered quietly. The room offered no answer. Slowly, he removed the watch from his wrist. The metal felt cool in his hands. Old, heavy, real. He opened the back carefully, revealing a tiny engraved inscription hidden inside. To Thomas. Until we make it home. Walter's breathing slowed. Memories came the way they always did lately. Quick flashes. Cold air. Distant engines. Young men pretending not to be afraid. He closed the watch again. For 70 years, he had protected it. Not because it was valuable. Because it was sacred. But now, Tyler needed tuition. Richard was drowning financially. And the family was quietly cracking under pressure. Walter leaned back in the recliner and stared at the ceiling. Maybe memories weren't supposed to stay buried in drawers forever. Maybe some things were meant to help the living. Even if letting go hurt. Especially if it hurt. The next morning arrived gray and cold. Walter woke before sunrise like he always did. Old habits survived even when everything else changed. He made coffee slowly, wincing slightly from stiffness in his hands, then sat beside the small window overlooking the backyard. Inside the main house, lights flickered on one by one. The family waking up, starting another busy day. Without him, Walter sipped his coffee quietly, then looked down at the watch beside the mug. A long silence filled the room. Finally, he nodded to himself. Decision made. Around 8:30, he grabbed his old coat and stepped outside. Richard noticed him crossing the driveway. Hey, Dad, he called from the porch. You going somewhere? Walter paused. Downtown. Richard frowned slightly. For what? Walter glanced down at the watch in his hand, then back at his son. Just getting something looked at. Richard nodded distractedly. All right. Be careful. Walter smiled faintly. You too, son. Then he climbed into the rusty pickup truck and drove slowly toward town beneath the cold November sky. Neither of them realized that within 24 hours, everything about their family was about to change forever. Walter had not driven downtown in months. Maybe longer. These days, most of his life happened within a 3-mile radius. The grocery store, the pharmacy, the garage apartment behind his son's house. That was what aging did sometimes. It slowly shrank the size of your world without asking permission first. His old pickup rattled softly as he pulled into a metered parking spot near Main Street. The November air carried that damp Ohio cold that slipped through jackets and settled deep into your bones. Walter shut off the engine and sat there for a moment. The watch rested quietly in his coat pocket. Heavy. He could feel it even through the fabric. For a second, doubt crept in. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe some things weren't meant to be sold. But then he thought about Tyler's tuition. Richard's exhausted face. The tension at the dinner table. And once again, guilt won. Walter stepped out of the truck and slowly crossed the street toward a small antique jewelry store tucked between a bakery and an insurance office. The sign above the window read, Harrison and Sons, EST 1948. The bell above the door chimed softly when he entered. Warm air wrapped around him immediately, carrying the faint smell of old wood, leather, and metal polish. Glass display cases lined the room. Pocket watches, diamond rings, military medals, vintage clocks ticking quietly against the walls. Walter moved carefully through the store, suddenly aware of how worn his coat looked compared to everything around him. A younger employee glanced at him briefly before returning to paperwork behind the counter. Walter cleared his throat. "Excuse me." The young man looked up politely enough. "Yes, sir. I was wondering if someone could look at an old watch for me." The employee gave the kind of smile people often gave elderly men. Patient. Professional. Not especially interested. "Sure. We can probably help with that." Walter carefully removed the watch from his pocket and placed it on the glass counter. The employee barely glanced at it at first. Then his expression changed slightly. He picked it up, turned it over once, twice. His posture straightened. "One moment, sir." Without another word, the young man disappeared through a back doorway. Walter stood alone at the counter, feeling oddly uncomfortable now. The store suddenly seemed quieter. A few minutes later, an older man emerged from the back room. Late 60s maybe. Gray suit. Sharp eyes behind thin glasses. He approached quickly but carefully. "Good morning," he said. "I'm Leonard Harrison." Walter nodded politely. "Walter Greene." Leonard gently picked up the watch. And for the next 10 seconds, the entire atmosphere changed. Walter noticed it immediately. Not excitement. Something closer to disbelief. Leonard adjusted his glasses. Looked closer. Then looked at Walter. "Where exactly did you get this?" Walter frowned slightly. "It belonged to a friend." Leonard's eyes narrowed carefully. "May I?" He gestured toward the back room. Walter hesitated, then nodded. The private office behind the showroom was lined with books, framed military photographs, and shelves full of antique timepieces. Leonard carefully placed the watch beneath a bright inspection lamp. His hands moved differently now. Slower. More respectful. Walter sat quietly across from him. The room felt strangely tense. Finally, Leonard spoke. "Mr. Greene, do you know what this is?" Walter gave a small shrug. "A Rolex, I think." Leonard looked up sharply. "This isn't just a Rolex." He carefully rotated the watch under the light. "This appears to be a 1943 Rolex Oyster made specifically for Allied military personnel during World War II. Walter blinked once. He had known the watch was old. Known it mattered. But not like this. Leonard continued. "These weren't publicly sold. Most were custom-issued or privately commissioned through military channels." Walter stared quietly at the watch. His chest tightened slightly. "Thomas." Leonard leaned closer. "My God. What?" Leonard looked directly at him now. "The engraving." Walter swallowed. "To Thomas. Until we make it home." Leonard exhaled slowly. "Do you realize how rare this is?" Walter shook his head once. "No." Leonard sat back carefully in his chair. "Mr. Greene, there are collectors who have spent decades searching for watches like this." The room suddenly felt too warm. Walter rubbed his hands together slowly. "How much is it worth?" Leonard didn't answer immediately, which somehow felt worse. Finally, "I need authentication to be certain." Walter nodded nervously. "But..." Leonard looked at him carefully. "If it's genuine..." He paused again. "Possibly millions." Walter let out a soft laugh. Not because it was funny, because the number sounded ridiculous. "No," he said quietly. "That can't be right." Leonard didn't smile back. "I'm serious." Silence filled the office. Walter looked down at the watch resting beneath the lamp. Same scratches. Same cracked strap. Same faded face he had looked at nearly every day for 70 years. Millions? It didn't make sense. "It belonged to my friend Thomas," Walter said quietly. "We served together during the war." Leonard listened carefully. "He gave it to me before he died." The words hung heavily in the room. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Leonard asked softly, "How did he die?" Walter stared at the watch for a long time before answering. "Bombing raid." His voice sounded distant now, like part of him had already left the room. "We were mechanics stationed outside London. Airfield got hit in the middle of the night." Walter swallowed hard. "He pushed me into a trench before the explosion." Leonard stayed silent. Walter appreciated that. Most people interrupted old men when they told stories. Leonard didn't. "He was 23. Walter continued quietly. "Always carried this watch." A faint smile touched his face. "Said someday he'd wear it home to Chicago after the war." Walter's fingers trembled slightly. But he never made it home. The office fell completely silent except for the soft ticking of clocks on the shelves. Leonard carefully removed his glasses. I'm sorry. Walter nodded once. So was I. Another long pause passed. Then Leonard leaned forward carefully. Mr. Greene, I need to ask you something important. Walter looked up. Has anyone else seen this watch? Walter frowned slightly. My family. And do they understand what it might be worth? Walter almost smiled at that. No. Then more quietly. They think it's junk. Leonard studied him carefully for a moment. You should be careful who you tell. Walter shifted uncomfortably in his chair. It's just a watch. No, Leonard said gently. It stopped being just a watch a very long time ago. That sentence stayed with Walter. Leonard offered to arrange professional authentication through a high-end auction house in New York. Walter almost refused. The whole thing felt unreal. Too big. Too sudden. But Leonard explained that serious collectors would need official verification before any valuation could happen. Finally, Walter agreed. Paperwork was signed. Photographs were taken. Insurance documents discussed. The entire time, Walter felt strangely detached from the conversation. Because deep down, the money still didn't feel real. Thomas felt real. The watch felt real. But millions of dollars? That belonged to somebody else's life. Not his. Before Walter left, Leonard handed him a business card. You'll probably hear from people very quickly once authentication starts. Walter slipped the card carefully into his pocket. Thank you. Leonard hesitated, then asked quietly, what are you planning to do with it? Walter thought about the question seriously. Tyler's tuition, Richard's mortgage, medical bills, the garage apartment, a long life of never having enough. I don't know yet, he admitted. Leonard nodded slowly. Well, he glanced once more at the watch. Whatever you decide, make sure it's your decision. Walter frowned slightly. What do you mean? Leonard chose his words carefully. Money changes how people see things. Then after a pause, sometimes how they see people. Walter drove home beneath a darkening afternoon sky, unable to stop thinking about that sentence. Money changes how people see people. The pickup heater barely worked anymore, but Walter hardly noticed the cold. His mind kept drifting backward. Thomas laughing beside an airfield. Thomas trading cigarettes for coffee. Thomas holding the watch while talking about home. 23 years old forever. By the time Walter pulled into the driveway, the kitchen lights inside the main house were glowing warmly. Family dinner again. Normal life. But Walter sat in the truck for nearly 2 full minutes before getting out. Because suddenly, nothing felt normal anymore. Inside the house, Linda was cooking while Tyler sat at the kitchen counter scrolling through his laptop. Richard looked up first. Hey, Dad. Everything all right? Walter nodded slowly. Yes. Linda glanced over her shoulder. So, what did the jeweler say? Walter hesitated. Just briefly. Then, he said it might be worth something. Tyler smirked immediately. Told you, Grandpa. Retirement secured. A few light laughs followed. Walter tried to smile. But something inside him felt uneasy now. Not because of the watch. Because for the first time in years, everyone at the table was suddenly paying attention to him. The house felt different after that. Not dramatically. Not immediately. Just different enough for Walter to notice. The next morning, Linda made him coffee before he asked. Tyler suddenly held doors open for him. Sophie asked questions about vintage watches. Even Richard seemed unusually attentive during breakfast. Small things. Tiny shifts. But after years of being mostly invisible, Walter noticed every single one. And honestly, it made him uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Walter sat quietly at the kitchen table, stirring cream into his coffee, while Tyler leaned against the counter nearby. So, Tyler said casually, what did the jeweler actually say? Walter looked up slowly. That it's old. Tyler laughed. No, seriously. Walter hesitated. He said collectors might be interested. Like how interested? Walter shrugged faintly. I don't know. That part was technically true. Because even after hearing the number yesterday, his brain still refused to believe it. Millions. The words sounded absurd inside his head. Like something from television. Not his life. Linda entered the kitchen carrying laundry. Well, she said lightly, if somebody wants to pay crazy money for an old watch, I hope you take it. Walter looked down at his coffee. It belonged to a friend. Linda gave a quick nod. I know, but your friend probably wouldn't want you struggling either. The sentence sounded reasonable. Thoughtful even. But something about it still bothered him. Not because she was wrong. Because suddenly everyone seemed interested in helping Walter make decisions about something they ignored for years. Richard came downstairs adjusting his tie. Dad, he said carefully. If the watch really is valuable, you should probably talk to a financial advisor before doing anything. Walter nodded politely. Maybe. Tyler grinned. Imagine if Grandpa's secretly rich. Everyone laughed again, but this time the laughter sounded different. Less mocking, more curious, and somehow, that hurt more. 3 days later, Leonard Harrison called. Walter answered from the garage apartment while watching rain drip slowly from the gutters outside. Mr. Greene, Leonard said carefully. The preliminary authentication came back. Walter's chest tightened instantly. And a brief pause. It's genuine. Walter closed his eyes slowly. Real. The watch was real. Leonard continued. The serial numbers match a limited wartime production batch from 1943. Extremely rare. Walter sat down heavily in the recliner beside Margaret's photograph. I see. There's more. Leonard sounded almost cautious now. One of the auction houses in New York wants a private meeting. Walter frowned. A meeting? Yes. Leonard exhaled quietly. They're estimating the value could exceed $20 million. Silence. Walter stared blankly at the rain outside. 20 million. Even hearing it again didn't help. His mind still rejected the number completely. That kind of money belonged to celebrities, executives, people on television, not an old widower living behind his son's house. Mr. Greene. Walter realized Leonard was waiting. Sorry, he murmured. I'm still trying to understand. I know. Walter rubbed his forehead slowly. What happens now? Well, Leonard said carefully. Once word spreads, collectors will start reaching out very quickly. Walter frowned slightly. How quickly? The answer came sooner than either of them expected. That same evening, Richard walked into the garage apartment, holding his phone with a strange expression on his face. Dad. Walter looked up from his chair. What is it? Richard held up the screen. There's an article online. Walter blinked. What kind of article? Richard walked closer. A military collector forum posted about a rare World War II Rolex found in Ohio. Walter stared at him silently. They mentioned your name. A heavy feeling settled into Walter's stomach. Slowly, Richard sat down across from him. You said the jeweler thought it was valuable. Walter nodded once. I didn't know how valuable. Richard swallowed. How much are we talking? Walter hesitated. Then quietly. They said maybe 20 million. Richard froze. Completely froze. The room went silent except for the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. Finally. 20 what? Walter looked exhausted already. They could be wrong. But they could also be right. Walter didn't answer. Richard stared at him for several long seconds. Then suddenly stood up. I need to tell Linda. Walter's chest tightened immediately. Richard. His son stopped at the door. Walter looked at him carefully. I'm still the same person I was yesterday. Something flickered across Richard's face. Guilt. Real guilt. I know, Dad. But Walter wasn't entirely sure he did anymore. By the next morning, the entire atmosphere inside the house had changed. Not subtle anymore. Obvious. Painfully obvious. Linda greeted Walter at breakfast with a brightness he hadn't heard in years. Good morning, Walter. Walter nearly looked behind himself. She never called him Walter. Usually it was, your dad, him, or simply nothing at all. Tyler came downstairs moments later. Morning, Grandpa. Then he actually sat beside him. Walter noticed immediately. You all right? Tyler asked. Walter nodded cautiously. Fine. That's cool about the watch. Walter gave a faint smile. Yes. Tyler leaned forward slightly. So what are you going to do with the money? There it was. Not cruelty. Not mocking. Something stranger now. Expectation. Walter looked down at his toast quietly. I haven't decided. Linda jumped in quickly. Well, obviously you should enjoy some of it too. Some of it. Walter noticed that phrase carefully. Not. It's your money. Some of it. Richard entered the kitchen looking exhausted. His eyes met Walter's briefly before looking away again. Nobody said much after that, but tension sat heavily beneath every sentence. Like the entire family was pretending not to think about the exact same thing. $20 million. Over the next week, things became worse. Not openly. Quietly. That was the painful part. Walter started noticing conversations stop when he entered rooms. Linda suddenly suggested moving him back into the main house, where he'd be more comfortable. Tyler began asking questions about wills, taxes, and inheritance in ways that sounded casual but weren't. Even Sophie, sweet Sophie who usually ignored him completely, started spending evenings in the garage apartment looking through old photo albums. At first, Walter almost enjoyed it. The attention, the company, the conversations. Until he realized something devastating. Nobody was interested in him. They were interested in access to him. And once Walter understood that, every interaction started hurting. One evening, he walked into the kitchen unexpectedly and heard Linda whispering harshly to Richard, "You can't let him donate it." Walter stopped instantly outside the doorway. Richard lowered his voice. "I'm not controlling, Dad." "You better start," Linda snapped quietly. "Do you understand what $20 million means?" Walter stood frozen in the hallway. "He's lonely," Linda continued. "If some museum or charity gets into his head, we could lose everything." "Everything. Not his money. They're everything." Richard sounded exhausted. "It's his watch. And we're his family." Walter quietly stepped backward before they noticed him, then returned silently to the garage apartment. That night, he didn't sleep much. Because for the first time in his life, Walter realized something terrifying. Money hadn't changed his family. It had revealed them. The calls started soon after. Auction houses, collectors, reporters, historians. One man from New York offered to fly Walter out privately. Another collector offered $7 million sight unseen. Someone from London wanted a video interview. Walter ignored most of it. The attention overwhelmed him. He still woke up every morning in the same tiny garage apartment. Still drank cheap coffee. Still folded the same old sweaters Margaret bought him years ago. Nothing about him felt worth $20 million. But the world kept insisting otherwise. One afternoon, Walter sat alone watching old war documentaries on television when Tyler knocked softly on the door. "Hey, Grandpa." Walter muted the TV. "Hey." Tyler stepped inside awkwardly. "You busy?" "No." Tyler sat down carefully. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Tyler looked around the small apartment. The peeling paint. The tiny kitchenette. The old recliner. His expression shifted slightly. Almost uncomfortable. "You've lived back here the whole time?" Walter smiled faintly. "Mostly." Tyler swallowed. "I guess I never really came in much." "No," Walter said gently. "You didn't." The honesty landed harder than anger would have. Tyler looked down at his hands. "I didn't know things were this." He stopped himself. Walter finished quietly. "Small." Tyler nodded slowly. Walter looked around the room. "It's enough." But even he didn't sound convinced. After a long silence, Tyler finally asked, "Did you really know the guy who owned the watch?" Walter's expression softened immediately. "Thomas." Tyler nodded. Walter leaned back slowly. And for the first time in years, somebody actually listened. "He was from Chicago," Walter said quietly. "Talked too much. Smoked too much." A faint smile appeared. "Thought he was funnier than he actually was." Tyler laughed softly. Walter continued staring toward the window. "We were kids." His voice lowered. "People forget that part about war sometimes." Tyler stayed quiet. "He used to carry that watch everywhere," Walter said. Said it reminded him there'd still be a future after the war. The room fell silent again. Then Tyler asked carefully, "Do you miss him?" Walter looked down at the watch resting in his palm. "Every single day?" But he only said, "Yes." Tyler stared at his grandfather differently after that. Not completely differently, but enough for Walter to notice. And that made what happened later even harder. 2 nights later, Walter woke up around midnight needing water. As he quietly entered the kitchen, he heard voices from the dining room. Linda, Richard, Tyler, arguing softly. "We have to think realistically," Linda whispered. "That money could change all our lives." Walter stopped moving. Richard sounded frustrated. "It's not ours." Tyler spoke next. "But Grandpa would help us, right?" Silence. Then Linda again. "He owes this family something after everything we've done for him." Walter felt the words hit like a physical weight. Everything we've done for him. Not. Everything he'd done for them. Not. 40 years raising Richard. Not. Working double shifts. Missing vacations. Selling Margaret's jewelry during hard winters. None of that existed anymore. Now he was simply an old man costing money. Walter quietly backed away before anyone saw him. Back inside the garage apartment, he sat alone in the darkness for a very long time. The watch rested heavily in his hands. "To Thomas. Until we make it home." Walter stared at the engraving until his vision blurred slightly. Then, for the first time since all this began, he asked himself a question he had been avoiding. What if selling the watch wasn't the right thing to do? Outside, cold rain continued falling softly across the backyard. and inside the little garage apartment behind his son's house. Walter Greene finally began understanding that some treasures carried a price far greater than money. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning. Heavy cream-colored envelope. Gold lettering. New York return address. Walter stared at it for nearly a full minute before opening it. Inside was a formal invitation from Whitmore and Vale, one of the largest historical auction houses in the country. They wanted to feature the watch in a private wartime collection event the following month. Estimated opening bid, $8 million. Walter read the number 3 separate times, then quietly placed the letter beside Margaret's photograph without saying a word. Outside the garage apartment window, dead leaves scraped across the driveway beneath cold December wind. Inside the main house, he could already hear voices. Excited voices. Linda had seen the envelope first. That was the problem now. Nothing stayed private anymore. By dinner that evening, the auction had become the only thing anyone talked about. Tyler had researched the auction house online. Sophie was reading articles about celebrity watch collectors. Linda kept mentioning financial security every 20 minutes. Even Richard looked overwhelmed. "We should probably get legal advice," he muttered while scrolling through his phone. "We absolutely need legal advice," Linda corrected immediately. "And tax planning." Walter quietly buttered a dinner roll. Nobody asked whether he actually wanted to attend the auction. Nobody asked whether selling the watch still felt right. Because somewhere along the way, the decision had stopped feeling like his. "You know what's crazy?" Tyler said excitedly. "One collector paid $30 million for a Patek Philippe last year." Linda shook her head in disbelief. "Imagine having that kind of money." Walter looked up briefly, then softly. "Some people do." The table went quiet for a second. Not because of what he said, because of how he said it. Calm, detached, almost sad. Linda recovered first. "Well, soon this family might too." That word again. Family. Walter noticed how often it appeared lately whenever money entered the conversation. Funny how wealth suddenly made everyone feel closer. After dinner, Richard followed Walter outside toward the garage apartment. Cold air hung heavily between them. "Dad." Walter unlocked the apartment door slowly. "Yes." Richard hesitated. "You know nobody's trying to pressure you, right?" Walter looked at him for a very long time. Long enough to make Richard uncomfortable. Then Walter smiled faintly. Of course. But both of them knew that wasn't true anymore. The following weeks passed in a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and interviews. Authentication completed. Historical verification confirmed. Military archives matched Thomas's service records. Every step somehow made the watch feel less personal. Less like Thomas. More like an object the world wanted to own. Walter hated that feeling. One afternoon, a young reporter visited the house for a local human interest story. Walter almost refused the interview, but Linda insisted it would build excitement before the auction. So he sat stiffly in the living room while cameras recorded him holding the watch carefully in his wrinkled hands. The reporter smiled warmly. "Mr. Greene, how does it feel knowing this watch could change your life?" Walter frowned slightly. The question bothered him immediately, because the truth was, the watch already had changed his life, just not in the way people thought. He looked down at the faded silver case. "It belonged to my friend," he said quietly. "That part matters more." The reporter nodded politely, but Walter could tell she wanted a different answer. Something bigger, more emotional, more marketable. "Do you plan to spend the money on anything special?" Before Walter could answer, Linda spoke from behind the camera. "His grandson's college tuition." Walter glanced toward her, then slowly back toward the reporter. "Yes," he said softly. "Maybe." But even as he said it, something inside him tightened painfully, because he no longer knew whether helping his family would heal anything at all. 3 nights before the auction, Walter couldn't sleep. The garage apartment felt colder lately. Or maybe loneliness just felt heavier now. He sat awake in the recliner wearing Margaret's old wool blanket across his knees. The watch rested in his palm. Outside, snow drifted quietly across the backyard. Walter rubbed his thumb across the engraving again. "To Thomas. Until we make it home." Home. Funny word. Thomas never got one. Margaret was gone, and Walter himself no longer felt entirely welcome anywhere. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Walter looked up. Tyler stood in the doorway. "Sorry," he whispered. "Didn't mean to wake you." "I wasn't asleep." Tyler stepped inside slowly. For a moment, he simply looked around the apartment again. The tiny space. The old furniture. The silence. You really stay up here alone every night? Walter smiled faintly. Most nights. Tyler sat down across from him. Neither spoke for a while. Then Tyler finally said, Mom's been acting weird. Walter almost laughed. Only recently? Tyler smiled awkwardly. Then his expression became serious again. I think everybody's scared. Walter looked at him carefully. Of what? Tyler hesitated. That things won't stay the same. Walter leaned back quietly. Things already hadn't stayed the same. That was the problem. Tyler looked down at the watch. Did you ever think about keeping it? The question caught Walter off guard. Yes, he admitted. Then why sell it? Walter stared toward the snow outside. Because I thought helping family mattered. Tyler frowned slightly. And now? Walter didn't answer immediately. Because the honest answer hurt too much. Finally, I'm not sure anybody sees each other clearly anymore. Tyler looked genuinely confused by that, which somehow made Walter even sadder. Because young people often believed greed looked obvious. Usually it didn't. Usually it looked like concern, responsibility, planning for the future. That was what made it dangerous. Before leaving, Tyler paused at the door. Grandpa, Walter looked up. I'm glad it was yours. Walter's expression softened slightly. Not because of the words. Because Tyler sounded sincere. And sincerity had become rare lately. The flight to New York was Walter's first time on an airplane in over 20 years. Whitmore and Vale arranged everything. Hotel, transportation, private security for the watch. The attention overwhelmed him almost immediately. Men in expensive suits shook his hand constantly. Auction specialists discussed market trends around him. Collectors stared openly at the watch during private previews. Walter felt completely out of place, like a factory worker who accidentally wandered into a billionaire's party. Because that was exactly what he was. The hotel suite alone was larger than Richard's entire house. That night, Walter stood alone beside the enormous window overlooking Manhattan. Thousands of lights stretched endlessly through the darkness below. Beautiful, cold, impersonal. A knock came at the door. Richard entered carefully. You okay? Walter nodded faintly. Tired. Richard looked around the luxurious suite awkwardly. Crazy, huh? Walter gave a small smile. Yes. For a while, they stood silently beside the window. Then Richard spoke quietly. Dad, I need to tell you something. Walter waited. Richard rubbed his hands together nervously. When all this started, I kept thinking about the money. Walter stayed silent. And maybe I still am, Richard admitted painfully. But lately, he stopped himself. Walter looked at him carefully. What? Richard's eyes lowered. I think I realized how badly we failed you. The room became very quiet. Walter could hear traffic far below the hotel windows. Sirens somewhere in the distance. A city full of strangers moving through the night. You didn't fail me, Walter said softly. Richard looked up immediately. Yes, we did. Walter studied his son's face for a long moment. The exhaustion looked real. The guilt looked real too. But pain complicated things. People could love you and still fail you. That was one of life's cruelest truths. Richard swallowed hard. You shouldn't have been living out there alone. Walter looked away toward the city lights again. It was easier. Easier for who? Walter didn't answer. Because they both already knew. The morning of the auction arrived cold and clear. Security escorted Walter through a private entrance while photographers gathered outside the building. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with quiet wealth. Luxury watches glittered beneath museum lighting. Champagne glasses moved through the crowd. Millionaires examined history like they were shopping for furniture. Walter hated it instantly. Not because the people were rude. Because Thomas would have hated it too. A young auction coordinator approached nervously. Mr. Greene, we're expecting aggressive bidding today. Walter nodded absently. We already have offers exceeding 18 million. 18 million. The number barely registered anymore. Not after everything the money had already done. As the viewing room filled with collectors, Walter stood quietly beside the display case holding the watch. People admired it constantly, but none of them understood it. They saw rarity, investment, status. Walter saw a 23-year-old kid from Chicago laughing beside military trucks in the rain. Completely different thing. A tall man in an expensive navy suit approached the display. Extraordinary piece, he said smoothly. Walter nodded politely. The man smiled. You're a very fortunate gentleman. Walter looked at him calmly. No. The man blinked slightly. Walter glanced down at the watch beneath the glass. The fortunate one died young enough to still believe the world stayed simple. The collector didn't know how to answer that. Neither did Walter. And as the auction room doors slowly opened behind them, Walter began realizing something terrifying. He wasn't sure he could actually let the watch go at all. The auction room was silent when bidding opened. Not completely silent. There were still soft coughs, the rustle of expensive suits, the faint clink of champagne glasses somewhere near the back. But underneath all of it, there was tension, the kind money creates. Walter sat alone near the front row while the watch rested beneath bright display lights beside the auctioneer. For a moment, it barely looked real anymore. Too polished, too protected, too far away from the muddy military airfields where it once belonged. The auctioneer adjusted his glasses. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced smoothly, "Lot 47. Rare 1943 Rolex Oyster military issue with documented wartime provenance." Large screens behind him displayed photographs of the watch. And then, a photograph of Thomas. Young, smiling, alive forever at 23. Walter's chest tightened instantly. He hadn't expected that. The room remained focused on value. But Walter suddenly remembered the smell of engine oil. Cold rain. Young men pretending not to be scared. The auctioneer continued. Opening bid, $8 million. A paddle lifted almost immediately. $9 million. Another. $10 million. The numbers rose effortlessly, like they meant nothing. Walter watched strangers compete over the last object his best friend had ever touched. $11 million. 12. 14. The crowd buzzed softly after every increase. Some people smiled. Some whispered calculations. Others watched Walter instead of the watch now, as if trying to understand the old man attached to the story. 15 million. 16. Walter barely heard the auctioneer anymore, because his mind had drifted somewhere else entirely. England. 1944. Thomas sitting on a supply crate smoking cigarettes. He swore he was quitting. You know what the problem with rich people is? Thomas had joked once. Walter remembered laughing. What? They think owning something means understanding it. At the time, they were just kids talking nonsense to pass time before dawn. Now the memory hit Walter so hard it almost hurt physically. 17 million. The room erupted in murmurs. The auctioneer smiled broadly. We are now at $17 million. Walter looked around slowly. Collectors, investors, historians, all staring at the watch. But nobody in that room knew Thomas. Nobody knew how loudly he laughed, or how he carried photographs of his mother folded inside his jacket, or how terrified he looked the night before the bombing raid. To them, Thomas was provenance. To Walter, he was still a boy who never got to grow old. 18 million. The room reacted audibly now. Even the auctioneer looked impressed. Walter closed his eyes briefly. $18 million. Enough to change generations of lives. Enough to erase every financial problem his family had. Enough to move out of the garage apartment forever. Enough to finally feel useful again. So why did he suddenly feel sick? The auctioneer lifted his hand dramatically. Do I hear 19? A paddle rose near the back. 19 million. Gasps spread softly across the room. The auctioneer smiled toward Walter. Remarkable. But Walter barely moved. Because in that exact moment, something became painfully clear. The watch was never supposed to save his family. Thomas already had. 70 years earlier. Walter slowly looked down at his trembling hands. Hands that should have died in that bombing field. Hands that built a life because another young man never got the chance. And suddenly, selling the watch felt wrong. Not financially wrong. Morally wrong. Like turning sacrifice into currency. The auctioneer raised his voice again. $19 million. Do I hear 20? A bidder near the center lifted his paddle. 20 million. The room burst into applause. Some people even laughed in disbelief. 20 million. Exactly the number that had haunted Walter for weeks. The auctioneer turned proudly toward him. Mr. Greene, congratulations. Walter stared at the watch beneath the lights, then slowly stood up. The room quieted immediately. The auctioneer smiled politely. Would you like to say something? Walter hesitated. Hundreds of eyes focused on him now. But strangely, he no longer felt nervous. Only sad. Very sad. He walked slowly toward the stage. The room remained completely silent except for distant camera shutters. Walter stopped beside the display case. For a moment, he simply looked at the watch, then finally spoke. My friend Thomas carried this watch every day during the war. His voice sounded smaller than the room. Older. Real. He used to say it reminded him there'd still be a future after all the killing stopped. Nobody moved. Walter swallowed carefully. He never got that future. Silence deepened around him. He died saving my life. The sentence landed heavily. Not dramatic. Not theatrical. Just true. Walter looked around the auction room slowly. And for 70 years, I kept this watch because it was the last piece of him that made it home. Several people lowered their eyes. Walter continued quietly. I know it's valuable. His fingers brushed lightly against the display glass. But somewhere along the way, people started talking about the money so much that they forgot there was once a human being attached to it. The room felt different now. Less excited. More uncomfortable. Good. It should have felt uncomfortable. Walter took a slow breath. I don't blame anybody for that, he said softly. That's what time does. It turns people into stories. Stories into objects. He paused. But Thomas was never an object. Complete silence. Even the auctioneer looked emotional now. Walter glanced once more at the watch, then made his decision. The watch is not for sale. A ripple moved instantly through the room. Confused whispers. Shock. Disbelief. The auctioneer blinked hard. Mr. Greene. Walter gently raised a hand. I appreciate every offer made here today. He looked toward the collectors. You've all been very respectful. Then more quietly. But I can't sell my friend's memory to the highest bidder. The room stayed frozen. $20 million. Gone in one sentence. And strangely, Walter felt lighter immediately, like something heavy had finally left his chest. A woman near the front wiped tears from her eyes. Walter continued calmly. I've decided to donate the watch to the National World War II Museum. More whispers spread across the room, but only under one condition. The audience listened carefully. Thomas's story goes beside it. Walter's voice cracked slightly now. Not mine. The emotional shift inside the room was immediate. Because suddenly the auction wasn't about wealth anymore. It was about grief, memory, love, survival, human things, real things. Walter looked toward the giant screen, still displaying Thomas's young, smiling face. He deserved to come home, too. That sentence broke whatever emotional restraint still remained in the room. Several people openly cried now. Even hardened collectors sat silently staring downward. The auctioneer removed his glasses slowly. No one cared about the bidding anymore. Not really. Because Walter had reminded everyone of something uncomfortable. Some things become smaller the moment you put a price on them. Hours later, Walter sat quietly in the hotel suite overlooking Manhattan again. But the city looked different tonight. Softer somehow. Less lonely. A knock sounded at the door. Richard entered first. Then Tyler. Then Sophie. Nobody spoke immediately. Finally, Richard crossed the room slowly. I saw the interview downstairs. Walter nodded faintly. News crews had surrounded the building after the announcement. The story was already spreading everywhere. Tyler looked emotional in a way Walter had never seen before. You really gave up $20 million, he whispered. Walter looked at him carefully. No. Tyler frowned. Walter glanced down at his empty wrist. I kept the only thing that actually mattered. The room fell silent again. Richard's eyes filled slowly with tears. I'm sorry, Dad. Walter looked at his son for a long time. And for the first time in weeks, the apology sounded real. Not because the money disappeared, because suddenly nobody in the room could pretend the watch was about money anymore. Richard lowered his head. We treated you terribly. Walter didn't rush to comfort him, because some truths deserved to sit quietly for a minute. Finally, Walter spoke softly. You treated me like I was already gone. Richard started crying then. Not dramatically, just the exhausted tears of a man finally seeing himself clearly. Walter placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. People were complicated. Families even more so. Love and selfishness often lived inside the same heart. That was the painful part. Outside the hotel window, snow began falling softly across New York City. Walter looked up toward the lights stretching endlessly into the darkness. Somewhere out there, strangers were reading headlines about the old man who walked away from $20 million. But they misunderstood the story. Walter hadn't walked away from fortune. He had walked back towards something far more valuable. And for the first time since Margaret died, Walter Greene no longer felt invisible.